Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Professor Hamamoto, and the date is December 15, year 2024. We're at the end of the year, and it's 4 o'clock p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Today, I have a special holiday treat for you. It's the author David Koenig, who's written several books on the happiest place on earth, otherwise known as Disneyland. And we'll talk briefly about his professional career in addition to being an author. And then he has kindly consented to taking some questions toward the end of this session right here. So get ready for that. It should be quite a scintillating discussion. So, with no further ado, I would like to bring to the stage Mr. David Koenig. And if you don't mind, I'll just call you David. You can call me Daryl.
That sounds good. Thank you, Daryl, for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. First of all, let me flash the books on the screen. This is maybe where you should start. There's a previous book. It's called Mouse Tales, and it's still available. It's in print on Amazon.com. There's a link below. Incredible. And believe me, it's dense reading. This is not something you're just going to flip through. And you're going to learn a lot. I thought I knew a lot, but you're going to learn a lot about the inner history of Disneyland. And this is the book that brought me to Mr. David Koenig. First of all, it was called The People versus Disneyland. By the way, the cover art on both books, all the books are really fascinating. So I salute whoever your illustrator is. Please pass on my fond regards. If you can't see it, it's a rat, as in Mickey Rat, in a lawyer suit, I assume.
That's correct.
And it's called The People versus Disneyland. The subtitle is How Lawsuits and Lawyers Transformed the Magic. All right. And from what I can tell, Mr. Koenig, David, has really no fondness for people of the attorney's species, having read all those cases. And believe me, he's been to the archives, he's done his work. His research fills all the criteria of scholarly research. However, it's not nearly as boring. It's very, very exciting, very riveting, very engaging, and it points kind of humorous, maybe not intentionally, but you will get a chuckle in certain places. So please go to your favorite bookseller and obtain that book, all of his books. And before we end here, I'm going to find out if David has some new projects, publications in the offing. Now, David, let's turn to you. From what I understand, you are a professional editor. That's your day job, right?
I am. Yeah, that's what I do by day is writing as well for a trade magazine company, as well as being the lead editor there. So we have a collection of for various industries, and I've been there for almost 40 years. So.
Oh my gosh!
Wow.
Is that the one that's located in Fullerton, California?
It's not in Fullerton. In Fullerton is where I went to, where I got my journalism degree at
Cal State Fullerton.
But it's in Costa Mesa, which is also in Orange County, about half hour south of Disneyland and of Fullerton.
Okay, and the publisher is the book publisher is in Irvine. Is that it?
Yes, correct.
So you cover all three stars of the Orange County universe.
I have a car, so I'm able to get around.
Now, as for yourself, I know you went to Cal State Fullerton and majored in journalism, but where did you grow up in? Did you grow up in Anaheim?
Not in Anaheim. I grew up where I'm working now in Costa Mesa, which is about 12, 15 miles south of Anaheim. So not, I think, now, did you grow up in Anaheim? Is that what
I did, yeah. I lived there for a total of maybe 10 to 12 years. That's why I thought you might have, we probably know pretty much the same terrain. Remember the Grant boys?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's where the Grant boys, and was there one in Anaheim?
Yes, that's the one I worked at.
Oh, you were? Okay, because there was one walking distance from my home in Costa Mesa up until just a couple of years ago. It closed down, but
oh, that's too bad. I worked there all through college. Not that one, the one in Anaheim.
Oh, okay. All right.
All right. And of course, having grown up in Anaheim, Disneyland always loomed large in my life. I think it warped my life for better or worse. So how did you get into the topic? It's fascinating.
It just, and you'll know this from growing up locally, but Disneyland when we were young is not was not visited like it is now. Now, half the guests on a given day will be pass holders who are there all the time. They're
Okay.
whether they visit every day or once a week. The regular visitors who's come often and often and often, and most people, even locals, are sort of gently nudged by Disney into purchasing multi-day passes. But when we were young, a trip to Disneyland for most people was like a vacation. It was, you might do it, even if you were local, you might do it once a year, once every other year. It was a very special, different thing than it is now. It's sort of not in quality, but in attitude towards so many of the guests is sort of like a trip to the mall. It's like, well, let's go hang out at Disneyland. And that there was no such thing when we were a kid. It was like we were the villagers, and it was the castle on top of the mountain, and it was like this, as you said, it loomed large. It was huge, but it was not quite as accessible as it is today, even though it was much less expensive. It cost you a few dollars to get in instead of a couple of $100.
I remember those days. That was the back of the model was the tickets, A
That
through E, right? Now, I have to admit, I haven't been back since that time. It's been many years, and there's been many different improvements or advancements since that time. Now, what compelled you? Because this book here, your series here, Mouse Stories, are these are based on actual interviews. I didn't realize that actual interviews with hundreds of employees,
Yeah,
cast members. They're called. Go ahead. Could you
absolutely.
explain? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I was going, I always loved Disneyland. Didn't have an idea to write a book about Disneyland until I almost graduated from college. I was a senior at Cal State Fullerton near the end of 1984, and many of my friends worked at Disneyland at the time. I didn't work at Disneyland.
Mhm.
But a couple were Jungle Cruise skippers, several worked in merchandise, others in other attractions areas, and they loved Disneyland. But they would come the next morning. I'd see them for classes, and they'd always have a couple of stories of just these silly, amazing things that happened at Disneyland that you would have never thought. Wait, that happened at really? That happened at Disneyland? Somebody did that, or that unfortunate thing happened, or humorous thing, or somebody tried to get away with this. And they were just such amusing stories. And then right before I graduated, all my friends and 2,000 other Disney employees went out on strike, and it was just the most surreal thing to see my friends who love Disneyland on the news and in pictures in the newspaper and quotes in the newspaper talking about how we got to maintain keeping Disneyland as a family. We can't let it turn into a big corporation, so we're going on strike, and they'll rethink their plan. And it was just again so strange to see these people who love Disneyland with picket signs with drawings of Mickey Mouse crying, and it was this big dramatic incident that went on for 22 days, and they finally realized Disney was changing. Whether they liked it or not, it was becoming the huge corporation they feared, and they slink back to work.
Mhm.
And starting at that point, Disney did, the change began. And it was at that time where I said, somebody has to collect the stories. This place is too unique, too interesting, and everything that happens in the real world happens at
Mhm.
Disney.
Yeah. And for my money, this is the best collection of those types of interviews that I've come across. I'm not a Disney expert. There might be other books, but I've read several of them. But this one deals exactly with cast members and I got to tell you, uh, your peers, your people in your age group who are coming back with these stories, they really enjoyed their pranks, didn't they? It's just like any college kids would. They would.
Well, exactly. And it's the same silly type of thing that would happen at working anywhere else, but yet it happening at Disneyland, and you're surrounded by tens of thousands of unsuspecting guests who are sort of caught up in the magic, and you can get away with just craziness, at least back then.
Mhm. It seems to me that the Jungle Cruise was one of the more attractive rides for the adventurous type people who would engage in such pranks as stripping down completely nude and jumping on a zebra or something. Do you
Yeah,
remember that one?
I do, and hundreds of other things would happen like that. And part of it was just the nature of that ride. That was the only ride, at least back then, where the cast members could break character. Everybody else in all the other rides just had to smile and nod and thank you and please and welcome and be careful. And the Jungle Cruise guys were there to be playful and to have fun and to make jokes. And as long as the jokes weren't, off color or anything, they were uh, unofficially permitted to go off script and, have fun with the guest. So
Mhm.
so they were cast to be people who were a little wilder, who had,
Mhm.
who could play that part. And when you put, a couple dozen guys like that all together, it was, Animal House at time. And there would be, jumping in the water and swimming around the lagoon and going on the islands and dancing with the robot natives and, and all these silly lines and jokes that they'd make up off the top of their head, often to have fun with the guest, sometimes at the guest expense, but that was never the idea to
Mhm.
you know injure the guest with their words, but to everybody to have a good time.
Absolutely. And I learned that in the Jungle Cruise, there were three real Smith& and Wesson pistols that were kept under lock and key. 13 rather,
13.
pistols. Every night they were locked up but I always thought they were fake because that was one of my favorite rides. And I thought they were using as like a starter pistol or something.
No, those were real guns, that they've been slightly modified, to hopefully prevent people from firing them. Though I fear that if somebody knew what they were doing, they could probably return them to their fireable state. And there were a couple times where even though they had a system to keep track of the guns, where a couple of the guns disappeared over the years and sent panic through the park of, oh no, who has this real live firearm in the gun and or in the park, and fortunately they were tracked down.
Mhm. Now, throughout this second volume, Mouse Tales, you have these inset anecdotes here that are called guestions, not questions, but guestions. Now, what could you explain what a guestion is according to the cast members, and what are some of your funnier ones, the most
Right.
amusing?
Well, you might have to read a couple. I
Oh,
none
okay. I'm
live
sorry.
right now, but a guestion, I'll set you up. A guestion, what that is a really dumb question that a guest will ask because they go to Disneyland, they walk through the front gates, and they sort of, as they say, check their brains at the gates. They just are so caught up with all the details, with all the fun, that they want Disney to do the thinking for them. They just want to show up, and if there's a line, I don't know what it is, but everybody else is doing it. I'll get in line. Or the simplest thing, they could be standing right under the bathroom sign. And in fact, I did this once myself a couple of years ago. Walk up to, I had to go to the restroom, so I asked to the nearest cast members, can you point me to the restroom? And he looks up, and we're standing underneath this gigantic restroom. And it's that kind of stuff. The most common one was, excuse me, can you tell me what time is the 3 o'clock parade? And they don't even realize what they're saying.
Right. Well, for the people who are watching, David and I, we lived in a amusement park rich part of the world because right on the other side of Orange County was Knott's Berry Farm. And it's miles away, by the way. And one of the questions is, does the monorail have a line to Knott's Berry Farm?
Yeah, very common. They would also, and this is with another park, it comes to mind is a frequent question was they were looking for the Matterhorn, but so many people would always ask the cast member, "Excuse me, can you tell me where Magic Mountain is?" And Magic Mountain is a theme park that's like an hour to the north. So that was a
There-
common one.
I don't know if that's because of cultural misunderstanding, because you had a lot of international visitors, or whether it's just that 30-point drop in IQ after they entered the front
That
entrance there.
that could be scientifically proved, I think.
Okay, there's this one exchange here, and these are all anecdotes you were jotting down from your friends.
Right, right, absolutely.
Yes, it says noticing employee roping off the parade route. The question is there a parade coming through? The cast member says, no, we just painted these ropes yellow and we're hanging them out to dry.
Yeah, so many and so many of the guests, they could say a silly thing like that. So many of the guests would believe them. They'd ask like, "Are those ducks swimming on the lake? Are those real ducks?" And the cast members will often tell, "Oh no, those are little robots we entertain." And they're like, "Whoa, they look so lifelike." And they'll just whatever. They'll ask what time it's going to rain. They think Disney has control over the weather, and whatnot. So it's a different world inside those gates.
Did you ever see the movie Truman Show?
I did. I did. Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like that was Disneyland was sort of the prototype for that direction that society was heading.
I'm sure that was an inspiration for that movie as well.
Well, let's move in that direction. You didn't cover it too much in the books, but was there some sort of cultural or social engineering taking place at Disneyland?
Yes, but not intentionally. I don't, that for Walt Disney, when he created Disneyland, he was just trying to take entertainment to the next level. He was always, I mean, that was his entire career, was create one thing and then move on to either something else or evolve that to a higher, better version. He created, Mickey Mouse silent cartoons when cartoons were these crazy things. And he sort of was the first one to build actual defined personalities and stories into the cartoons. And then from that, he was the first one who had, a cartoon that had sound, and then the cartoon that was in color, and then a cartoon that was, feature length. And he took that into live action movies. And he was just trying to constantly one up, the first, the nature documentaries and with stories, which had never been done before. And so with Disneyland, it was like, okay, how can we take people and have them live the part of the movie? 3D movies were becoming something, a big hit in the early 50s. And he thought he could beat that times 10. So he wanted people to actually live their own stories and interact personally with the characters in them. So that was the idea for Disneyland. But he was a showman, so he was always trying to cast a show. So it was, when Disneyland first opened, it was sort of, ethnically, genderly, everything, everybody, women couldn't be ride operators, except for there was only one ride that they were allowed to be ride operators on, and that was the Flight to the Moon ride, because that was sponsored by TWA, which wanted the ride to be like a trip on a TWA spacecraft, in which they'd have stewardesses. So the women could be the stewardesses for that, but everything else, it had to be a man to work, and all the secretaries had to be women, and all the ticket sellers had to be women. And it was, minorities had certain, okay, you can be a gardener, or you can be a janitor or something, but no, you can't deal with the guest. It was very, not perfect in those ways in any way, and took many years and lawsuits and protests and changes of management for them to open it up. And it was always, Disneyland was always a couple steps behind society in so many ways. So it wasn't really engineering the society to teach a lesson or for people to come and be more like it. It was trying to mirror society, only it was like 10 or 20 years behind.
All right, I like that answer, because that after all is one of the principal arguments of the people versus Disneyland, how Disneyland was, and the Disney organization was transformed by lawsuits, including equal opportunity type legislation and lawsuits, discrimination, including the termination of employees who were older, who just about ready to be fully invested in the investment program. That part really caught my interest. Now, most of these attractions, when you when you think about it, including the one you just mentioned, were sponsored by these globalist companies like GWA. And you're probably old enough to remember Monsanto's
Mhm.
House of the Future.
Right.
Now, that was not coincidental, was it?
Oh, no, it was, well, I mean, it wasn't, I'm sure, I mean, I can't read anybody's mind, especially of 70 years ago, but I'm sure
Hmm.
Walt Disney was not trying to say, hey, I'm targeting these specific companies because I'm trying to, make some sort of political statement. What
Hmm.
he was doing was he needed money to open and operate his park, and that's where the money was. So it's like,
I see.
Bob's Burgers is not gonna pay
No.
$1 million a year to sponsor an attraction, but a company like Monsanto would give you $1 million a year if, when Disneyland first opened, you would give them their own exhibit called the Monsanto Hall of Chemistry, where you could go and view chemistry exhibits. And as long as you use Monsanto plastics and other products in the building of the park, uh, then okay, and that shines a good light on Monsanto, gives Walt his money to build the park, and everybody's happy. So
Hmm.
that's sort of how those sponsorships went. It
I
was.
see.
I'm certain it was not trying to, no political statement. It's like he needed money. Who had the money?
Well, speaking of which, the Walt Disney Company didn't start getting into the black, the profitability, until it started getting U.S. government defense contracts during World War II, doing propaganda films, even doing Fantasia and all these great classics and Sleeping Beauty that we know today. They were always operating in the red until they seemed to fuse or at least accommodate themselves with government outside funding.
Yeah, well, what that was, and you're absolutely right. And from project to project, some would be unprofitable, and some, like Snow White, would be massively profitable. But on the whole, from year to year, it was not a very profitable company because Walt always had another idea, and he always used to drive his brother, who was the money man, crazy because Walt would always go, okay, that's good, but what if we did this and spent twice as much money? And his brother was like, oh my gosh, well, Walt, whatever you want to do. So he would have all these crazy ideas. In movies like Pinocchio, which considered one of the finest animated movies ever ever created, lost money when it first came out. Um, but it was with the government contracts where they were hired to make specific films and to use their personnel and expertise and facilities to create government projects and government propaganda and things. That was guaranteed money. That was
Mhm.
that was no, unlike everything else they did, which was, okay, we spend $1 million and then throw it out to the public and see what they think are the, is it going to win, lose? We don't know. But with the government work, that was all profit all the time. It was like you would,
Guaranteed.
yeah, it's going to cost you $1 million to make that work for you. We'll give you 2 million. And so Roy
Mhm.
Roy Disney, Walt's brother, was like, "Oh yeah, okay, that I like that." And that was that's all through the war that helped them quite a bit.
Wow. So after that point, though, do you think that that connection between the Defense Department maintained itself? Because I remember when I was a kid, I'd watch The Wonderful World of Disney when they moved over to television, and they would feature with Walt Disney himself such individuals as Dr. Werner von Braun of Project Paperclip.
Yeah, I don't know that there was any official connection beyond the war years, but
Mhm.
Walt was always trying to, attach himself with the best known expert in whatever field,
Mhm.
celebrity, people who could think of new ideas. Often that was someone associated with the government, sometimes the military, but it wasn't. I don't think, at least with Walt, who was calling the shots up until the time he passed away, politically he was not that interested. He was an idea man. He was a
Mhm.
storyteller, and that's what he cared about. And whatever new thing he could think of is what always caught his attention.
Mhm. Well, he put, according to your books, a great store in what his come to be known as Imagineering. That seemed to be his strength in all his areas there. Was there some sort of dark side to him, though? I mean, did you ever delve into his persona, Walt Disney, as a conceptualist? Because the first book I read about Disney was called The Dark Prince by, I think it
Oh,
was Mark Elliott. Are you familiar with it?
unfortunately, yes.
Oh,
There's
okay.
a lot of
Yeah.
inaccuracies in that book.
If you
There's a
don't like it, please tell us why.
there's a lot of good information too. He was the author was able to interview a number of people who never taught, who were never interviewed by people at all about their work with Disney, especially some animators who were laid off during the big strike in the early 40s at the Disney studio. So he was able to get a lot of history and stories and insight from people that you won't find anywhere else. So there are really important things in that book, but there were also it reads as if he took a lot of liberties and made a lot of assumptions, and took a lot of hearsay and turned it into plausible things that could have happened about Walt Disney really being the illegitimate son of the maid or something. It's been a while since I read it, but there's a number of claims he makes in the book that just don't hold
Mhm.
water, and that were, at least when the book came out 30 years ago, were celebrated. You got to see this groundbreaking revelations, and it was the biggest claims were ones that are almost demonstrably false.
Mhm. Yeah, certainly, that's a book that got me to thinking about the whole Disney vision of America and the world a lot more differently, and
Yeah.
strangely enough, led me to your work, which is
Oh,
also, I think, a landmark in Disney studies, if you wanna call it that.
well, thank you. But to answer your question about, did Walt have a dark side?
Mhm,
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think he was beating children or anything. He wasn't, intentionally hurting people or anything like that. But he did have a temper. He could be short with people. He was extremely demanding. He did not pay his employees very well, and he could be distant. So he had his good days and bad days, like all of us. And
mhm,
so many people want to canonize him because he did so many wonderful things and created uh, so many products and songs and movies and places that we just adore and can't imagine our lives being without. So we want to imagine deify him almost. Was just a guy. I mean, he was brilliant. He was I believe a good person. Most of the people, not all, but most of the people who worked with him and for him loved him and loved working for him. But it wasn't, he was very demanding, and he had his ways, and things had to be his way or there would be trouble. And
mhm.
so I don't know if that counts as a dark side, but he was certainly a complex, deep person.
Yeah, he seemed like a super, super creative, highly intelligent, of course, individual. So do you think it was his brother Roy that kinda kept the organization on an even keel, not just financially, but managerially?
Yeah, that's not just think. That's everyone will tell you that, because
Okay.
they were opposites in the way that if Walt were let loose and he could do and would do whatever he wanted, the company would have gone bankrupt time and time and time again. In fact, his first several iterations of the Disney company all went bankrupt until he invited his brother Roy to come along and move with him to California and then start a company together. And that happened started 101 years ago, when that version of the Disney Brothers studio, which became the studio we have now, or the Disney company we have now, that was the first time that they sort of teamed their opposite geniuses together. This
Mhm,
highly creative, recklessly risk-taking fellow who seemed to have his sense on the taste of the public, but would try anything. And the very conservative, don't take a chance, watch every penny, make sure there's a profit margin. Brother, having them together is what, because if either would have been 100% in control, either Walt would have driven him out of business, or Roy would have homogenized the company to the point that it would have been dull, uninteresting, and there wouldn't have been products that anybody would want to buy.
Mhm. Okay, great answer to that one. I mean, as a business case study, that can't go any better than the Disney organization. Now, so far as returning to this book here, The People versus Disneyland, there was one section there where you talk about how same-sex couples were starting to go to Disneyland to dance because they were. I remember some of these get-together. I grew up in Anaheim, used to go to Disney all the time, and there were. It was very appealing for teenagers to go there and dance, either slow or fast dancing. But initially, there was a prohibition
Mm.
against same-sex dancing. Can you run us through that?
Yeah, this was back that prohibition, which nobody thought twice about it in the 50s and 60s and 70s, but into the 80s, it started to become for Disney what they considered to be a problem. And that really surfaced when they opened it for the first time a dance club at Disneyland. This would have been in about 1986. They opened a place called Videopolis, which is in the back of Fantasyland, which at night all the disco lights came on and the rock band and people dancing around, and people of all persuasions were wanted to visit this club, and Disney was trying to keep this 1950s Ozzie and Harriet facade over that was their theme, that was this is where fathers knows best is our the theme we're going for. And so same-sex couples were not allowed to dance with each other. Is that the security would go out and break them up and tell them you need to find someone of the opposite sex to dance with. You guys can't dance. And they're like, wait, well, what if we're not hugging, what if it's not a close dance? We're just, I don't care. And they would, it was over the top, and all the security guards, you had to be over 6 feet tall and very burly to be a security guard in that day. So they would intimidate or drag people off the dance floor. And so a lawsuit was struck by people, and it's interesting, and it ended up changing it and having Disney rethink its stance and to allow same-sex couples to dance. But it was started by several plaintiffs who their purpose was they didn't want to dance at Disneyland. They had heard about what was happening at Disneyland, and they wanted that to change. And so it started with some folks in their early 20s who said, let's purposely go to Disneyland. So a gay gentleman found another guy, a friend of his. They weren't really a couple, but they went to Disneyland precisely to get kicked out. And it worked. They went there to dance and to change the law. And as soon as they were kicked out, they now had ammunition to file their lawsuit and to make a big stink about and expose what Disney was doing. And Disney held firm, and it went back and forth until it finally went to court, and Disney was forced to allow the same-sex couples to dance. And that was at first it was like, okay, just fast dancing apart, but don't touch it, that type of thing. And eventually to where you are today, where it's second nature.
Mm-hmm. Well, that contradicted my impression. I remember those days because back then I had long hair and I couldn't get in the park. They had a dress code.
Yeah.
But my understanding of the parent corporation itself was that it was very progressive socially and culturally. It was known as especially the animation department, the film division, was known as being gay friendly.
Yeah. And I think that's true. But it was because that was sort of at the studio, behind the studio gates. But
right.
Disneyland they viewed as something different. It was like, okay, we're putting on a show here for the public, and the public, shouldn't see a a female Jungle Cruise skipper, you wouldn't that would be preposterous. That the guests would be up in arms if if Sally the skipper was giving our tour. You'd go in on a ride on the Nile, and you're gonna trust your life to a strong strapping gentleman. It was that type of thing where they couldn't, anything that conflicted with the show that they had foreseen that they were trying to put on, they would not allow. There was, through the first several decades of Disneyland's existence, there was just this intense inflexibility to the show, to the code of whatever they deemed it was, and that was solely because it was, this was their public interface, as opposed to, like you said, the animators. That was, it wasn't a personal thing for most people who work for Disney, I think, so that the animators can do whatever they want, or the executives or the Imagineers or people who weren't out there playing a Disney character. That was a different a different dynamic there.
Well, I haven't been to Disneyland for, as I mentioned already, for several years, but I hope that doesn't mean that I would go there today and see Snow White, one of the main characters, walking around, and it's a 400-pound man in a beard.
Well, not yet, but I mean that could happen one day. I mean, there are male operators they allow to wear dresses at Disneyland.
Really?
Yeah,
At Disneyland?
at Disneyland. So, I mean, if they allow that, whatever the next step is, I expect, Disney is, as you say, extremely progressive in that sense. And, who knows where we'll end up.
Okay. Now, you're much younger than me, but do you remember the case of the one of the ride operators who got squashed in one of these moving dioramas? Do you remember that? So back in 1974.
Yes, it was. Yeah. Deborah Stone.
Yes.
Yeah. She was, by all accounts, a wonderful, wonderful person. She, I think, had recently turned 18 years old, and there was a ride there, a newly opened ride called America Sings, which was this giant carousel theater that had been previously used for an earlier show called the Carousel of Progress. They wanted General Electric, which was the sponsor of that show, wanted their hit show Carousel of Progress moved to the brand new Walt Disney World in Florida. So they moved the show and they built a new carousel building in Florida, and they needed something to do with this carousel building. So they put in a show with animal songs through the decades. But they made a mistake, what I view, of for whatever reason, having the theater turn the opposite direction, so that as the seats rotated around these stationary stages, instead of the attendant who was on the stage, instead of the walls getting farther away from them, the walls were closing in on them, so that if they got in the wrong spot, they were in deep danger. And that's what happened. Is a woman, the 18-year-old, was caught in the wrong place, whether she was getting a water bottle, or I don't know that anybody knows if she was retrieving something or getting her sweater, or what, and nobody really knows, but she somehow went a couple of feet in the wrong direction and was caught between these two walls, and she was squished between the walls. And it's perhaps, for me, the most tragic thing that's ever happened at Disneyland.
That's right, and that's why I looked specifically for that case that involving Miss Stone there. But what astounded, I learned this from your book here, what astounded me is that the family it didn't astound me they were stonewalled by Disney so far as the investigation is concerned. But the parents found out exactly what went on. They managed to get the records, but they didn't sue the company. Is that correct?
That's 100% correct. And part of that, and probably the biggest reason for that, is her parents are two of my favorite people in the world. They are just, we've become friends over the last several decades. They are, I can't imagine, I mean, it's inhuman how wonderful and sweet and good her parents are. And they understood, accidents happen, and that this was unforeseen. How this happened? Certainly, they could have had a case to argue that Disney had created this ride without any safety mechanisms at all,
Right.
creating this dangerous situation which placed their daughter in extreme danger. But they just wanted to know what happened, and
Yeah.
Disney would not tell them because Disney was afraid that Disney didn't believe them. They thought they were just trying to get ammunition to get more money, and if that they were open and honest and shared everything and what went wrong, that the Stone family would then have more ammunition. Um,
Mhm.
but they, it took a few months before they could, and their lawyer could legally obtain the information so they could get an accident report and other information, so that they fully knew what happened to their daughter. And then they settled for pennies. It was, just basically to cover their costs and
Yeah.
a little more. And they walked away, but they are just the most, God-filled, wonderful people. I can't say enough
Mhm.
about, and I'd like to think that, that's the way
Yeah.
to do it, I guess.
Well, back then, I think as late as even in '74, Disney had the Disneyland had this aura attached to it that, "What? You can't sue Disney. You can't sue Disneyland." And as you point out in your book, after a while, uh, attorneys would not want to have their cases be tried in Orange County because they had Disney had the home field advantage. And the sentiment throughout the entire county, especially Anaheim, where I grew up, it's like Disney is king, right? They said, "Forget it, you're not gonna prevail against Disney here." So,
Right.
were they, did they befall that fate there, that invulnerability of Disneyland?
Did who befall that?
The Stone family, did they
Oh, well, it never
adopt
got
it?
to court. All they were after is they just wanted to find out what happened. So
Yeah.
once they got the information,
Mm,
and they knew the full story of what went wrong and what happened to their daughter, they were done. That was it. They
okay.
dismissed the suit without prejudice, settled for like a pittance just to cover their costs,
Mhm.
and that was it. But what you say is true and was extremely true, back in when Disney first opened, and people thought, oh, this place is perfect. This is so safe. This is nothing ever goes wrong. Disney actively discouraged any news of anything going wrong at the park from getting out in the press. If they could, unless there was some sort of, police investigation or an ambulance had to do a report or something, news of things happening at Disneyland in the 50s and 60s would not make it into the papers. You would, nowadays with everybody's got a phone and, the social media is everywhere. If anybody trips on a curb, it's like on TMZ or something. So it was a very different world.
True.
And it had much more control. And so people just, all the local juries had, oh, the Mickey Mouse, he wouldn't hurt anybody. So it was, and it's still a little bit now like that, uh,
Mhm.
which at least I don't know if numerically it still checks out, but lawyers do actively try to do whatever they can to get cases moved out of Orange County. And I
Mhm.
just because they're convinced there still is a pro Disney bias here, and the numbers do back them up. If you look at the percentage of cases that are won outside of Orange County, they have a much greater chance of beating
Yeah.
Mickey. you know,
And as you point out at the very end of your book, it's kind of like an appendix, and you answer the question, "Is it worth it ever suing Disney?" And you
Mm,
tell them straight out, most likely no.
yeah.
It's gonna be a really tough row to hoe if you go up against, the mighty Disney company. So with the last 15 minutes we have there, I'd like to devote, some of your responses to questions here in the, chat room. So ladies and gentlemen, if you have, something specific you wanna know about, please put it there, and I'll put it up on the screen here and ask David, uh, Let's see. It says we used to love. Okay, that's everybody, right?
He wants once a year. That could be everyone. Now, Daryl, let me ask you a question. You said something that I didn't get a chance to ask you about, and you
All
said you
right.
could go to Disneyland for a while because you had long hair. Did you?
Yeah.
Because this, for people who don't know, in the late 1960s, as the hair started getting longer, Disney did have a ban which lasted for several years that if your hair passed your shoulders, you literally were not allowed in the park.
Right.
And did you just know so you didn't go, or did you go and they
No,
told
I went. I was turned away, and I will say, David,
yeah.
and you're welcome to interview me at any time. I think I'm the only person I know that ever snuck into Disneyland and got away with it.
Oh, fill me in.
Well, remember they had the UV stamps for people who left and wanted to come back. Well,
Hmm.
my friend figured out he'd go in, pay, get it stamped, and then we went to the restroom outside the park, and
Right.
he managed to transfer his image to my hand,
Oh.
so that when I stuck my hand under the UV, it looked like I'd paid.
Oh, very clever. All right.
Yeah.
So
So,
maybe you're the reason why they eventually changed that system to where you had to not only show your hand stamp, but you also had to show your ticket.
all right. I think that must be me. I'll
So
take it.
you'll take that credit.
Yes, I will. Thank you very much. Now, this is not a question, but a comment. But I'll turn it into a question. Says Brad Scott says, both of you are great if you like movies from the golden age of Hollywood. Um, Thank you very much, number one. But David, I mean, you're totally into American popular culture because you already did a couple books on Columbo too, which is another discussion, a television show for those who don't know. How important to you was this Americana, this golden age of movies and television, and of course Disneyland? Seems like it's consistent with each other.
Yeah. Well, it's important to me just because not only is that the entertainment I enjoy, but I believe that, and this is not to insult anybody or anything, but I believe a lot of the pop culture items that we enjoy and we immerse ourselves are going to have an effect on us for bad or worse. And so for me, if it's like a Freddy Krueger movie or a slasher movie, that's not my thing because I
Mhm.
just don't think that that's going to be good for me. Maybe that would be exciting and get my heart pounding, but I don't see anything good for me. And I so wish that there was more. I don't want to say old fashioned entertainment because it could be, some of the things I enjoy now are more modern and fast paced. And the skill of the television and movie makers now is I mean, they can do anything with special effects and whatnot. But it would be so good if it's good lessons and good stories and things that can uplift people. And that's for me what I find mostly in movies and television and the theme parks of the past, even more than today.
Okay. I tend to agree with you on that one. This is Corky Goss, one of the moderators, says stipulated reality. I'm not familiar with that concept. Stipulated reality in general, it's a flex. Could you elaborate on that? I don't fully understand the question, but stip,
If
stipulated in what enforced reality? I guess that's what he means.
I'm
Com-
I'm not I'm not sure. I think perhaps what might be getting at is by stipulating a reality is by forcing some artificial reality on others, perhaps, because that's
uh-huh.
certainly what Disneyland is about.
Mhm.
And it's changed so much, and as a result of lawsuits or the threat of lawsuits or of just growing up and realizing not everybody subscribes to these parameters from
Mhm.
55, and they had
Right.
to loosen up.
Okay. Speaking of loosening up, here's a question about woke. Disney went woke, flop, but don't give a damn because woke ideology is here to stay. I don't know if this person's critical of woke
So
ideology
yeah,
or
I'm not sure if they're that, but it certainly is a very common complaint about I'll be honest. I think Disney gets criticized sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly by
Mhm.
everyone. I don't like no matter where they choose to be, and nowadays they choose to be fairly political. And many years ago, they intentionally, with Walt, tried to be as apolitical as possible. They wanted to
Mhm.
just, you know, uh, whatever the middle America, safest vanilla option was, that's what they wanted. And if somebody would tell them, well, actually, the middle is here, they probably would have gone to here because they weren't trying to insult, or they weren't trying to preach anything in particular. They were trying to be as vanilla and as crowd pleasing as possible. And now, for whatever reason, they have taken political stances. And so you get a lot of people who don't like those political stances who will say, oh,
Mhm.
they're woke now because they used to be here and now they're here. And other people who are here or wherever else don't like the stance because it's not woke enough, or it's not whatever, it's not, doesn't agree with them. They're not doing it the way they want. So I guess that's just part of something all of us have to deal with everybody we know, is that wherever
Mhm.
we choose to be in politics or anything else, you're always going to risk insulting somebody if you take offense at someone having a difference of opinion.
Right.
So that's for me, the world is better if you have, you know uh, it's much richer if you have people with all a variety of different ideas, as long as people aren't hurting each other or anything like that.
Mhm. Now, you cover a couple of instances where some, I don't know, which creepy people were molesting women, touching them inappropriately in rides and so forth.
Right.
But I didn't get a sense that sexual assault was a problem in Disneyland.
I don't think it's a big problem, because it's just they have security everywhere. They have
Mhm.
cameras everywhere. It's a something that's going to be hard to get away with for an extended period of time. And there have been some kooky guests over the years who, like, when people squeeze together in the elevator on the haunted mansion, and the lights go out, we're known to grope other guests. There've been accusations of that. But in other isolated incidents, and there's been some managers who have come under accusation that they molested coworkers or such like that. And unfortunately, that type of thing is going to happen at any company, especially any big company at Disneyland. But it does not appear to be something that's a recurring problem, or at least a widespread problem, from what I understand.
Mhm. Well, I'm getting a lot of questions here in the live chat about the P word, that is crimes committed against children in specific. And you're probably aware as anybody else that there are occasional reports that come out
Yeah.
concerning Disney employees, film directors even, who are involved in this type of activity. But when it's associated with Disney, it really gets people attention. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that, David.
Yeah, well, and that has been a problem. It mostly happened at Disney World in Florida as opposed to Disneyland, although there have been, from what I understand, at least a couple of cases
Mhm.
reported at Disneyland. Uh, uh, and I think it's part of any type of business that there's going to be a large number of children, and it's going to put adults in contact with children. It's just sort of unfortunately, it's like if you ran a daycare center, there's the opportunity for that, or a nursery or preschool, or something else where there's a lot of children around and you're entrusting adults to children. And Disney, I think, has done a good job, at least in recent years, of trying to create separation between employees that would have contact with children. Uh,
Mhm.
and there's, you know, I don't know of any situation where an employee would be left alone with a child in any circumstance at Disneyland. Maybe there may be, and I'm not thinking of it, but I
Mhm.
can't imagine any incidents where there would ever be an occasion for that to happen. Even the characters who were known to, hug children through their costume and stuff, there's always a second attendant there next to the costume characters at all times nowadays. That
Mhm.
was the true, 50 years ago, but it is now.
Okay. Thank you for that. There's a question by one of our moderators here. I think she's referring to the earlier question, or a couple of questions actually, because some rides were deficient in guardrails. It says there should have been guardrails to protect the people.
Is that metaphorical guardrails, or is that physical guardrails on a certain attraction? Or
I'm not sure, but you could take either or both.
okay, because what Disney has changed in their attitude toward protecting their guests. They always, when Disneyland first opened, it always preached that safety was the most important thing. But really, wink, wink, them putting on a fabulous show was the most important thing to them. And they certainly would never want to hurt somebody. It was never their intention to hurt anyone, but it was like they were certainly willing to take risks if it was a good show. One of the opening days attraction was stagecoach rides, in which they had these rickety little stagecoaches that they would stack half dozen guests inside and a half dozen guests outside, and with a team of 4 horses, send that just running through the thing, and those things would flip over, and people suffered broken backs and all sorts of broken limbs. And one of the stagecoach drivers was paralyzed after one flip over. And at first Disney was like, "Oh, that's too bad, but we're Disneyland, we're going to keep doing it," and then it was like, well, what kind of, is there anything safety wise we can make it a little safer while still protecting our show, because we still need a stagecoach ride in the Frontier. And then eventually they realized, you know what, this can't work. We unfortunately quietly have to get rid of this attraction. But it was around for like 5 years, and that attitude has changed from Disney sticking by its guns to protect its show, to realizing, it's a much better show if it's if people aren't getting hurt. And so they started putting things like literal guardrails on rides where there literally were none, because they figured people would just sit in their attraction and wouldn't stand up, and they wouldn't climb out. I mean, it's obvious. You're on a roller coaster, you're not going to stand up. And it's like, wait, maybe people will. So nowadays they try and think about 5 steps ahead of the guest of what conceivably could anybody think of to get themselves in trouble. And we're going to put guardrails everywhere. And if you go to Disneyland now, you can't walk 5 feet without seeing some safety warning or precaution or safety strip on the ground or anywhere. They are so conscious to protect their guests now. It's made for a slightly less wondrous show, because before it was like, it's so easy to get caught up, like, oh my gosh, I really am in the Old West, I'm in Frontierland, I'm walking on dirt. What is more dirt in Disneyland? Those days are gone, because that's an uneven surface. Everything's got the little yellow safety tape and everything. That so you would never mistake Disney any longer for the real authentic Wild West. But I think it's a small price to pay for people keeping their limbs intact.
I'd agree there. Yeah, that the whole suspension of disbelief credo has been thrown out in exchange for the safety element there.
Yeah. So I wish they didn't have to, but
yeah,
I think they do have to.
Right. Well, I'm going to give Kathy Sue the final question here. This is not a question I even knew existed, but maybe you could. That's why maybe David can answer it here. She asks, Kathy Sue asks, could Walt Disney really look down Main Street from his second-story office and watch people enter the park? I didn't know we had an office in Disneyland.
Well, almost, not quite. He had a second-story office that was behind Main Street, behind where there was an old house farmhouse that used to be on the land when Disney bought the property. There are actually 2 farmhouses, and they pushed them together and put them behind the right side of Main Street, where today you have the Mr. Lincoln ride. There was these 2 houses pushed together, which those were the original administrative offices. And on the corner office on the second floor was Walt's office, although he spent very little time there. But there wasn't a whole lot to see, because that was all backstage. But what he did have actually in public almost was the second story of the firehouse. And this wasn't his office. This was his in-park apartment. and
Oh,
it is still there, still furnished with Walt's original Victorian furniture. They keep it as much as Walt would have it, just out of his memory and out of kind of a tourist attraction. You can actually go on a behind the scenes tour, and they could take you up and show you this. But that was situated in such a way where he could look out, and he couldn't exactly see people coming through the front gates because you have to pass underneath the train tunnel. But once they came underneath the train tunnel, he could see them out the window coming into town square where the flag was and where you board the train and such. And then he could, around the corner, they would start walking down Main Street. So he could see that town square area.
uh-huh.
He couldn't exactly see down the street until he came out in the morning, before, whenever he frequently on weekends would spend the night there. During the week, he lived up in LA, and that's where his studio was, and he had so many other things besides Disneyland that it usually just weekends that he'd spend the night at the apartment. Then before they opened early in the morning, he'd put on his bathrobe and he'd walk out before any guests came, and the sun was just coming up, and the employees were just trickling in, and they were hosing off the street to get it all ready, and it was glistening, with the little sun coming up, and he'd go get some orange juice from the little coffee shop and talk to people along the way, because he was, for the most part, not hanging out inside Main Street talking to people, but he wanted to know what people wanted.
Mm-hmm.
He would always, the painters and the coffee shop, the baristas, everyone who would care to talk to Walt, he'd just ask him, how you doing? What's your concerns? How can we make this better? And, so he through that way found out what people wanted.
Wonderful. He's the ideal manager. He's on the floor checking things out himself. Yeah, I didn't know that he had that apartment on his. Is that in one of your books? That anecdote you just
in the
told
in the
us here?
first book, I'm sure information about that is in there, and you can sit the next time. I know you don't go to Disneyland often, Daryl, but the next time you go, hopefully it'll happen again. You don't have to cut your hair. You go in, underneath the train tracks on the left side.
Mm-hmm.
You'll first pass by City Hall, which is where the tour guides hang out, and if you have any problem, they can help you. The very next building, before you get to the Emporium, on the side is the firehouse, and on the bottom is they have the old fire wagon, and upstairs you could look and you'll see a little lamp burning in the window with the little curtains, and the lamp is sort of always lit, and that's supposed to signify that Walt's spirit is always with us, looking over us, by lighting that lamp. And whenever Disneyland's open, that lamp should be lit.
Okay, the next time I go, that'll be the first place I hit.
Yeah.
I thought I knew it, but I'm always learning from you and your writing.
Never been inside. That's my dream, is one day to get inside that, just to check.
Okay.
Yeah, there
I think
was
as an author, I think you might have a leg up on that. But on that line, has the Disney Corporation ever gone after you legally, like saying we're going to sue you for this material?
Not exactly, though. When they did hear I was researching on my very first book, this is back in the late 80s and early 90s, before I'd written anything. They didn't know who I was. They just knew that I was interviewing a lot of people and asking about their dirty laundry and their secrets and things like that. So I did get numerous letters from their, at first it was their publicity department, and then it turned into their legal staff, warning me that I should not be writing a book. They did not authorize me to write a book. I was not allowed to write a book. That would be illegal. I was prohibited to write a book. So I wrote a book. That's it. I figured it's all true, and if it's written in a nice way, it's not, because I love Disney. I'm not trying to I want as many people to go to and support Disney as possible. I think they're doing a lot of great things. And,
I'm so glad that we ended on that positive note. You went against Disney's suggestion, quote unquote. They were trying to intimidate you, and you prevailed as a journalist, as a writer. Yeah. And I respect you for that and congratulate you for your efforts on our behalf, really.
Thank you so much.
Now, on that score, what do you have going now? Another book, perhaps?
I have my next thing. The last book I wrote was about the TV show Columbo, as you said, and that in about a month or so, That's a revised edition is going to be coming out in paperback for the first time. So that should be out in January, called Shooting Columbo, and it's all about the misadventures that they experienced filming that television show.
Right. I think it's already posted on Amazon.com.
In
Shooting Columbo.
hardcover. It's you
hardcover. Oh, okay.
hardcover now for about another month, and then the expanded edition in paperback.
Okay.
Shortly.
I'll get that. And how did you get into Columbo? Do you view yourself as sort of a Peter Falk type?
No, but
because he's always asking questions. He pretends.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
It's just a show I've always enjoyed, and then I'd always heard that there was because Peter Falk was this lovable character who was, I guess, just could be a terror in real life. Even though people loved him, he was just this very demanding person to work with, who was very eccentric as well. And I had always heard a lot of interesting, crazy stuff happened behind the scenes making the show, which nobody had ever written a book about. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to figure out if I could get that information. And I did. So I was able to interview many people, find a lot of production reports and production diaries and such that I was able to share, the story of what really happened. And it's that's how, just to share a good story that had never been shared before was my hope.
Oh, great. Well, I'm going to order that book and absorb it because, as you can tell, I'm a creature of television and Disneyland.
Oh, okay, good.
Generationally. Mr. David Koenig, thank you so much for your time. I know your time is valuable. It's precious, and you shared a lot of great insights from hundreds, if not thousands of hours that you devoted to an American institution. Whatever people feel about it, Disneyland and Disney is there for us to understand, appreciate, or criticize. And you've done a wonderful service to our culture and society and our understanding of American political expression, I think. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
All right. Good evening to you, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I had many more questions to ask, but we've left an opening for perhaps a return visit for Mr. Koenig. So thank you very much for spending your Sunday, at least part of it, with us today. And we'll be back with you next week, God willing. And happy holidays, everybody. I'm going to be sending you a little picture of me with my Christmas tree in a couple days or so. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your support. Bye.